Um, yes, good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to each and everyone. I see the EPA membership is well represented. And then also a warm welcome to our special guests, not only from our partners, but also from the rest of the industry. And I'm sure, obviously, everyone agrees that nothing starts as good as a Friday. But unfortunately, as good as a Friday starts, we're currently in the middle of a global geopolitical event that makes me, at least, and I'm sure everyone, very anxious. It feels like we just won COVID and that it's essentially behind us. And now we have to deal with the threat of war and potentially world war for that matter. So yes, it's literally on the other side of the globe, but with technology, it feels like it's happening in front of us. You know, when you watch the news, when you watch social media, I mean, the pictures and the videos that comes through is absolutely horrific. And nothing is as traumatizing as war and the impact it has on human lives. So it really doesn't feel like there's a lot of kindness going around at the moment. And maybe today's topic, kindness, inclusion in action, will help a bit in our individual experiences and how we influence the world around us. So guiding us through this thought-provoking topic today is our esteemed chairperson, Cynthia, also the MD of Ethics Monitor. Those of you who don't know Cynthia, Cynthia has over 15 years experience in the field of workplace ethics and governance. She's a published author in the area of workplace ethics and is a regular speaker in workplace ethics at conferences and is often interviewed on TV and radio as an ethics expert. As a special guest this morning, we have and are really honored to have Professor Jess Auerbach with us. Professor Auerbach is currently transitioning from the Northwest University's Anthropology Department to Program Director for the MPhil in Inclusive Innovation at the UCT Graduate School of Business. She holds a PhD in Anthropology from Stanford and MSc in Refugee Law from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. And she's also the author of Archive of Kindness, Stories of Everyday Heroism from the South African Lockdown. Very interesting book. It's certainly on my list. She was also founding faculty of the African Leadership University in Mauritius and has extensive publishing, teaching, and research experience bridging Africa, North and South America, and the Indian Ocean region. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cynthia and Jess to enlighten us on this topic and much needed attribute we so desperately need in the world today. Thank you, Cynthia and Jess.
Thanks, Stefan, for that introduction, and always lovely to be part of these EPA events. And I must say, I think it is very fitting that we, for this webinar, have looked at, as Jess and I were discussing the other day, have looked at a positive topic that we can so easily get swept up in not only the global negativity, but in the enormous amount of unethical conduct in our country. As you know, I mean, there's not a billboard or a newspaper that wouldn't remind you of that I think it's time for us to not lose sight of the positive that should inform our role as ethics practitioners, and that a positive role that ethics should fulfill in the organization. So Stefan, thanks for that. And can I add a welcome to Jess? It's lovely to be chatting to you about this topic. Let me then kick off by, I think, Jess, your publication of Archive of Kindness is really such a noteworthy publication. And I'm pleased to say, of course, I do have it and I have read it, obviously. But I wonder if I could start by saying to you, won't you tell us about the book? And also, I mean, I think it would be so great if you wanted to share a couple of your favorite stories from the book.
Thanks so much, Cynthia and Stephen, and for the invitation to be here, and thank you all for listening. It's a great event, and I didn't know about this association before, but it's been really reassuring and reinvigorating to kind of come across it and have this invitation. So yeah, the book started actually out of a bit of a personal crisis, because we landed up not having a place to live in the pandemic. There were various circumstances to that, but we bought a house and couldn't move in because of the timing of it all, and the people weren't able to leave. And so we suddenly got very stuck, and somebody we didn't know who lived nearby just gave us the keys to her home and said, she was going to spend lockdown at her brother's house, and she said, please, move in. And that was quite remarkable for us because she literally didn't know our last names. And because I'd written a lot about Angola, I lived in Angola for many years doing work on post-war recovery in that country. I thought, it's interesting at a scholarly and a personal level how when you have unprecedented circumstances, and you can look at Ukraine now and see the same thing, people open up their hearts in very different ways, and you suddenly have this real outpouring of goodness. And then I got hired at Northwest in the middle of the lockdown. And of course, we had to really rethink education in a way that honestly I think is quite long overdue. And one of the things we had to do was think, how do you get students how do you grade students if they can't do exams? And in my mind, that's like finally we can start teaching them something practical. So in this particular case, I got my students involved in expanding this archive, because I then, out of that personal experience and particular trauma, had started documenting the ways in which people were helping each other around the country. And I'm sure you guys all saw that especially those initial 3 weeks where people were just like, yo, we have to rethink our lives. And so I had already got about 700 stories in this archive, and then got my students to start interviewing people and finding out what was happening in their communities all around the country. And the book really happened when I read the student evaluations. Normally as a professor, you kind of dread that moment because you never know what they're going to say.
Indeed.
Yeah. In this case, the students, one said that he wasn't going to immigrate anymore. Several students said that it had stopped them from being in spaces of depression, that while they'd been going through these enormous traumas in their personal lives and their families' lives and their learning lives, the push towards a focus on kindness had really made a difference. And so then I thought, okay, maybe we better do something with this, because then we had 2,500 stories. And so the book came out of that, and we got some prominent South Africans to review a short list of the stories and choose them, and then we raised some money and were able to pay a wonderful young illustrator who himself had finished his fine art degree during the pandemic and had experienced and received a great deal of kindness and also contributed to it himself. And then this book emerged, and it's been such a lovely journey because it captures tiny little things. I mean, to your question, Cynthia, about some of the stories that stand out for me. I mean, it depends a bit on the day. So in the end, there's only 50 stories in the book. And of course, there are many, many more in the archive. But some of my favorite stories, we've lost Cynthia, but I'm sure she'll be back, include something like, for example, when we were all in our houses, something I certainly wasn't thinking about was that there was suddenly a national blood shortage. And so nurses around the country organized themselves that at the end of these very grueling shifts, they would then go and donate blood and make sure that we didn't run out of blood for other kinds of emergencies. Lots of stories of people cooking and supporting one another, and many stories of people working with families in education and children as well. Maybe I'll stop there, Stephen. Do you want to jump in?
No. I think we lost Cynthia for a moment, so I'm happy just to stay with you, that you don't feel too alone.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So I'm listening. I'm all ears.
Okay, well, sure. I guess maybe I can just carry on with some of the things we kind of.
Absolutely.
But is that fine? Or if anyone has a question that you'd like to ask now, I'm also happy to take any questions or any thoughts.
Sure. No problem. You go ahead, and then we'll keep you company.
Okay,
Don't worry. So I think that what we are looking at here is extended power failure. But I think that actually, in terms of the talk, as Stefan said, I think that everyone would love to hear a little bit more about what that entailed, given exactly where we're all sitting at the moment. So we're both here, and I think that she's just going to reconnect as I checked in with her on WhatsApp. So we're all good.
Okay. Cool, perfect. Well, I mean, I guess to these kind of events, it's exactly that we were experiencing in the lockdown, where suddenly all the structures that normally support us, that normally hold us, disappeared almost overnight. And so from workplace to kind of transportation, to exercise. And it was really interesting just to see how everyone suddenly started thinking about their neighbors, about their communities in different ways. And one of the things I found very powerful teaching at the university is that we all know that our students come from very different kinds of backgrounds and different experiences, but it's the first time that in higher education, we really had to take that into account, and we had to make sure, you're back, that's wonderful.
Well done.
I'll just finish. Great. So I'll just finish the thought. Cynthia,
Yeah.
just speaking about these kind of contingencies in lockdown and how we had to adjust. And with the teaching, obviously in my profession, it was clear that we really had to meet our students where they were at. And I think that workplaces were exactly the same, where you had to really consider, where do my employees live? How many people are in their house? What kind of food reserves have they got? Are people managing their mental health okay? And some of that was stressful, but I think it was a really good moment for reflection for all of us, because people also found themselves really empowered to do something to change the situation. And across South Africa, you saw the emergence of these community action networks. You saw people cooking, you saw people supporting education programs, making sure that children didn't fall too far behind. And it was those kind of tiny little actions that actually made a huge difference and really transformed experiences from being super traumatizing to being quite empowering. But I think we need to capture and we need to hold on to, because as Cynthia started by mentioning, it can be rough looking at the news every morning, and it can be really debilitating and disheartening. But at the same time, we all also know that everyday life in South Africa is just a one series of miracles after another. When you consider our history, when you consider the ways in which this is a challenging, difficult society, I find it astonishing that people somehow manage to make it work and somehow manage to transform their lived realities. And so, I don't want to be overly Pollyanna-like, and I think sometimes focusing only on the good can be a problem. But I think it's valuable also to remind ourselves that in the midst of these challenges, we also actually have the skills we need ourselves. And a lot of those start with kind of personal actions in the immediate community that then have a huge magnifying effect.
Yeah, I mean, Jess, I think that that's such a lovely start to this conversation, to again emphasize the fact that when we're looking at kindness, I often think we need to recognize it's got almost a contagious effect, a ripple effect. That it's never, kindness is never neutral. It doesn't just sort of hit a brick wall and stop. And I know that the stories in your book illustrate that so extraordinarily well. And again, I mean, in terms of recognizing kindness, I'm sure that we're all aware that, there's a global kindness day, but there's also, which is November, but there's also a random acts of kindness, not only a day, random act of kindness week. And there have been many corporates, I know Dis-Chem was one of them, that ran an initiative. I think they ran it with Cape Talk around random acts of kindness. So I think for me, the impact of it is what we shouldn't forget, and not only shouldn't forget, but that we should bring to the fore. But what I think flows from that so nicely is the question of how I see, how we see the link between kindness and ethics and of course, inclusion, given the topic that we've chosen. And here, ethics, of course, we would appreciate that a fundamental concept in ethics is whether you like, King Ford's term of stakeholder inclusivity. I like the term inclusive ethical boundaries. I think it has such a nice word picture about boundaries that are inclusive rather than excluding people. And so that as a core concept clearly means we should be taking into account the concerns and the interests of others. And, I know we can get technical and speak about affected stakeholders, but there are so many people in our realm. And when we're then speaking about the self and other of ethics, the issue of stakeholder inclusivity is such a big deal, and it's core to all the acronyms, the DEI, the diversity, equality, and inclusion, and actually I like the variation on that, which is diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So sometimes diversity, equality, and belonging, there's a play on all of those. And here, I mean, to use a simple example, to not simply connect what's the relevance in terms of stakeholder inclusivity, but to connect kindness and inclusivity. I think that there's certainly a great intention in many organizations to be inclusive, but I think there are unfortunately a myriad of examples where we haven't got it right across a whole host of dimensions. And so in our pursuit in the EPA to support our ethics practitioners practically, I think an interesting example is to say, if we put together a group of people and said, I want you, you got 5 minutes, I want you to name 3 actions that would really promote stakeholder inclusivity. You know, they might pause. I'm not saying they wouldn't get it, but they might pause. But if we said, I want you to think of 3 acts of kindness that you can share with people in your circle, with the stakeholders in your sphere of influence. Actually, could you name 3 acts of kindness? Easily. So it is, for me, it's a very accessible concept. It's, of course, with all the positive connotations that you've already surfaced. But I took it a step further in terms of saying that when I am, for example, being kind to you, by definition, I'm taking into account your concerns, your situation, your needs, your interests. By definition, I'm actually being inclusive. And so I think that reframing it, as the title says, that kindness literally amounts to inclusion in action, I think is a very nice approach. And I think that's something that could be used in organizations very successfully. And tapping back to your opening comments and Stefan's introduction, I think that we're in a situation in the world and in our country where we have a great need of more kindness, of more caring. So for me, that connects very nicely.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cynthia. I mean, there were a few things I loved about what you were saying, and one of them I think is also just highlighting the value of friendship. You know, I think sometimes we don't take it seriously enough, and we say, okay, well, as long as you're collegial, that's enough. And sometimes I'm not sure that it is enough, particularly in South Africa, where we have a whole set of historical reasons that prevent us from knowing one another deeply. And I think that as soon as people are able to cross the kind of formal boundary of collegiality and actually have some sense of how does my colleague live, who do they care about most, what are the responsibilities beyond the workplace that they hold and that they balance, and find the points of commonality, that's really where, when we think about South African transformation, I think that's where a lot of the kind of most powerful shifts happen. And around the pandemic and the ways in which people had to step up and find ways to be kind. And I hear this beautiful example that's in the chat at the moment, and maybe others might want to share things in the chat as well. But in the processes of doing that, it was quite internally transformative for individuals and therefore also for organizations, because you can do a whole bunch of kumbaya, holding hands, diversity and inclusion workshops. But if people aren't actually caring about one another and don't have an understanding of one another's lives, it's very difficult to go beyond the kind of surface level corporate diversity poster. And I think the beautiful thing in South Africa is people want to go deeper. They actually want to make it a different kind of experience. And I'm currently chatting with UCT about taking some corporate examples from South Africa and using those examples to teach diversity all around the world. Because if you look at the corporate sector in South Africa, there's been such a remarkable transformation that honestly, we should be teaching Harvard how to handle diverse teams, not the other way around.
Exactly. And again, I mean, we would so readily focus on the failings in terms of diversity. And of course, there are failings, even now after all this time. But again, it ignores the fact that, and I agree with you, not in a Pollyanna way, but it's saying, can we please pause and recognize our successes? Can we recognize our strengths? You know, Jess, something that I'd also like to chat to you about and get your view on is, you know, I thought Rutger Bregman's book was such a powerful book, and I must say I absolutely loved it. For those of you who haven't read it, I mean, he's a Dutch, I was going to say journalist, but he's so much more than that. And he wrote this wonderful book called Humankind, 2 words. And the qualifier after that is a hopeful history. And what he's done is that the most extraordinary amount of research that went into this is he posed the fundamental question, Jess, that I think is core to what we're talking about, which is I'm hearing your positive view about people here, but I mean, we have to surface the question of, are people inclined to kindness? Or does that selfishness prevail, which is the underpinning thesis of Rutger Bregman's book? What are your views, Jess?
So, I mean, speaking as an anthropologist, really, I think that if people weren't slightly inclined towards kindness, we wouldn't have humanity. I mean, we've been very successful as a species at propagating ourselves. And a large part of that is because actually we support one another and we create mutually beneficial societies all the time. I mean, you have strong men, and we can think of Putin, and we can think of plenty of other examples. But these are definitely the anomalies, because if we had lots of Putins, we would have blown ourselves up a long time ago. And I don't mean to make light of a very serious situation, but if you look at the historical record, I mean, what we would call pro-social behavior is absolutely essential for human survival. And we have young who are very vulnerable and absolutely hopeless. If you were to leave a baby on its own, it would die. And so, so at a very fundamental level throughout human history, we have learned to cooperate and we've learned to be kind. And then we've also learned that we have to compete over scarce resources. And so I do think that there are moments where when people feel stressed, and you can see it biologically, that the kind of stress hormones that get released, there's a kind of shutting down almost. And it was interesting to watch the debates around the vaccine nationalism, where a lot of wealthy countries said, we're going to shut our borders and keep the vaccines for ourselves. And I think that speaks to something that is also part of humanity, about wanting to protect the people one loves. And so then the question for me in a country like South Africa is, if the national project, the project of being a nation, is actually going to be successful, you have to make sure that at the moment when people shut down, they don't go into the smallest possible unit of my family, perhaps my racial or ethnic group or my religious group, whatever, but they go to something more inclusive. And that's something that I think we do have tremendous capacity for. We see example after example after example in history, and so far we've survived as a species. I mean, it's, you know, and this is part of the Bregman's argument, is, you know, we've managed it.
Indeed,
obviously it's challenging, but I think I'll wrap up the point now. But just in amplifying the good, we're much more likely to continue to flourish in that way, because obviously negative clickbait is much easier to propagate than stories of kind of individual heroism. And a big part of why I wrote the book is because I was so annoyed with expat South Africans living overseas who constantly feel like they're almost relishing the fact that South Africa is moving from one crisis to another. And so, oh, you know, look at that, it's a failed state. And in my experience, those are mostly people who are desperately missing their home and desperately missing the beauty of South Africa, the complexity of it, the climate. And a lot of the time they drive global North media, which then celebrates South African failures. And I just thought, like, I'm so tired of this narrative that takes such a singular look at South Africa without seeing the everyday miracles.
Yeah, indeed. And Jess, I think you captured the rationale and much of the essence of Rutger Bregman's book so very well. And I do think that when people are under huge duress, and especially, you know, when we're looking at circumstances of poverty, I'm sure you and our audience would have heard that, you know, the World Bank report came out on the Southern African Customs Union as among those 5 countries as the most unequal area in the world. Now, you may, colloquially, we've always known that, but this is absolutely current. It was released now on the 9th of March. So when we look at our society, as you've just depicted, I mean, there are, when I say fault lines, I mean, I'm using such a light term for such a serious issue. But moving this issue and this question into the workplace, I here have to say that you know, the national and the international problems are of enormous scale, and in many cases we could well throw our hands in the air and say, honestly, I don't know how to solve this. But I think we should always remember that when we're looking within the context of the workplace, we're in a much more contained environment, and we should never forget that we're in a much easier context to make change, not because it is rigidly ring-fenced, but by definition, it has a entity and a status and a purpose that is particular to the organization. And I say again, therefore, much easier to implement or make changes or drive, for example, an important ethical issue like inclusivity in an organization. And I think there's quite a lot that we can discuss on that. But I mean, just before we move on, to come back to one of the opening points around the wonderful ripple effect of kindness, that it always has, you know, a greater impact. I often say to organizations that where they have, I don't know, driven a great ethics project, where they have implemented really wonderful ethics training, where they've got wonderful awareness programs, I always say to them, can you remember that the benefit is not only for your company in as much as your employees now, and I'm not saying it's a panacea, but where your employees have thought, that was so interesting, and do start to reflect more consciously on ethics and the need to be ethical. I said, can you recognize the benefit is not only for your company? If I'm the employee, can you see that if it was successful, I take it home to my family, I take it home to my community, and without wanting to exaggerate the point too much, I often say, always remember the 3 C's. It benefits the company, the community, and that little ripple effect also has a positive impact on the country. So these initiatives, I think, have a huge value, and again to stress not only that it is relatively speaking easier to deal with the problems in your country than someone saying you're in charge of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. That is an extraordinarily complex situation, easier in your organization. But here, as I say, we need to recognize that there is such a strong tendency in our country to focus on the negative for all the reasons we understand. And corporate shouldn't fall into that trap unduly. It shouldn't be only about fighting corruption and you know, getting rid of fraud. Of course we need to do that. But we advocate very strongly a dual approach to ethics. And the dual approach is, of course, a situation where, of course, you need to minimize misconduct. But the key issue I always ask is, but what are you doing to strengthen ethical conduct? What are you doing to strengthen values? And you know, it's also at a sort of cliched level, it's a really feel-good area. So yes, of course, you know, rules and regulations, consequence management has never been an optional extra, despite what we see around us. But for me, the whole kindness as a path to putting inclusivity into action falls into that wonderful positive zone of consciously and intentionally introducing part of your ethics program as strengthening ethics and strengthening values in the organization.
Absolutely, and I think when you speak about the impact at a company level, what strikes me is that we don't live in the country in as much as in our day-to-day lives. We're not thinking, well, here I am walking down the street in Cape Town being South African. You think, here I am in Cape Town being in Cape Town. And there's something about us living on the streets and in our own minds. And we do have a lot more control in those spaces. So yes, I can't fix load shedding much as I'd like to. But what I can certainly do is I can make sure that the impact of load shedding is lesser on the people around me, on the people with whom I'm interacting, on my students, for example, in my particular role at the moment. And the one thing that I think is really emerging as a critical 21st century question that we all have to engage is, how do we manage mental health? Because we've never lived in an environment where we have so much information. And as Stefan was mentioning at the beginning, you know, yes, Ukraine is far away, but we're all seeing images of a maternity hospital being bombed in live time and having to grapple with that. We're all recognizing that people from Africa are being treated completely differently to people from Eastern Europe and and parts of the Caucasus. So how do we grapple with the intense emotions that those kinds of experiences, images, exposures raise up, whilst we're also looking at, as you say, just one thing after another of negative news in the country? And I think that increasingly we have to develop tools of mental health, otherwise we will all have nervous breakdowns. And those are very serious, that there's almost an information overload, that our brains are not actually wired to process very well. And I see with teaching, a large part of what I'm doing more and more is teaching students how to manage information and how to manage their mental health, because we don't really need to teach content anymore, because they can find it on the internet if they know how to use the internet properly. But that you can't do anything if your mental health isn't in a good place, and if you can't show up to do the small pieces you have to do. And so I think, at least in some of my scholarship, really thinking about how we capacitate ourselves and other people just to change the things you can. It's that really cliched thing, that you see on your grandma's fridge. God, give me the serenity to change the things I can and to accept the ones I can't. There's something super cliched about it, but it's also really important information, like most things from grandmothers, right? That,
yeah.
There's a sense of we can actually manage our own mental health to a large extent. And if we're not receiving the input that we need, we can go to our managers and we can go to our CEOs and say, yes, this is a mess, but you've got to give us tools that make us stronger, because otherwise we're just going to sit under the table and weep. And that, I think, is also really, really important when we think about ethical behavior, because if you don't see yourself as having power, how can you possibly stand up in an unethical world? How can you possibly say, well, there's a point to me not appropriating these funds because, the whole planet's going to go up in flames in 20 years anyway, if you read the climate change literature. So you've got to do something to really make sure that people feel okay on the streets, that they feel okay in themselves, that they feel okay in their minds. Now, is it, some people would say, oh, well, that's just naive and that's, silly. But I'm like, at the end of the day, I'm a lot happier when my mental health is good. Call it naive, call it silly, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I sleep easily, I have successful relationships, I'm fulfilled at work. That is what I experience, and that is what the people I love experience. And so my hope is really that we can shift the needle slightly, just so that more people are experiencing well-being despite adversity, because it's probably only going to get worse given climate change. And just at a very pragmatical, now I have high functioning autism, so please forgive me if I'm too blunt, because I see it as my strength, and occasionally it surprises people. But the way my brain is wired, it's just like, here's the reality. Now, how are we going to cope? And I think focusing on kindness and on ethics are really, really, really critical interventions there.
Yeah, I must say, Jess, I think your inclusion of mental health is such an important issue, and I think so many would agree that sort of counterintuitively, one of the positives that came out of the pandemic, which, by the way, today was declared a pandemic 2 years ago, today. So I think that one of the positives that came out of the pandemic was a far, far greater recognition of the issue of mental wellness. And I think that while there were areas that recognized it, I think that prior to that, yes, there were employee wellness programs, but it wasn't really recognized in the workplace nearly to the extent it is. And interestingly, I saw an incredibly poignant picture with graphics on it recently, and the picture was of Robin Williams, which as we know, amazing actor, who committed suicide suffering from depression. And as I say, the caption was terribly poignant, speaking of course to another point, and it said, depression is never fake. Pretending you're okay can be fake. Full stop. Little space, next line, be kind. And I thought, again, I suppose I was alert to kindness given our forthcoming conversation. I think there's another very real point in what we pretend and what we don't. But I think kindness is also making the space so that you can be frank with me. It's making the space so that you'd be comfortable to be open with me and not think you're walking into a judgmental situation where I'm saying, oh my goodness. And so, as I say, I think when we're looking at kindness, we need to look at it very broadly. I was taken by, and I must say then I couldn't find them, I was taken by a news report on radio yesterday, that was talking about an organization that, I mean, jumped to, in no time at all, to provide especially bread and sandwiches to Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, because the food shortages, in fact, the recent food shortages were largely bread shortages, and the organization called itself Random Acts of Kindness. And I must say, I didn't look that hard. I didn't manage to track it, but it encouraged me to say that when we look at kindness, we need to start looking at it in the broadest possible sense. And here, one of the thoughts, and I'd be pleased for your comment on, one of the thoughts I had is that kindness can often, if we almost in a knee-jerk sense, kindness can often amount to charity or philanthropy. And here you can take this wonderful organization that, as I say, I mean, you know, produced an enormous amount of food and clearly of huge benefit to all the patients there. So I'm not for a moment ignoring the good, I'm not ignoring the sound intention. But it also occurred to me that when we're looking at charity, charity is so often a distant thing. You know, I put a debit order for, I don't know, you know, 100 Rand a month or whatever the case may be. And now I feel like I've done something good. And of course, you know, if those funds are being well deployed, of course you've done something good. But an interesting thought I had that, as I said, I'd like to run past you, is that where we're looking in the organization, and here, of course, any organization, public or private, and where we want to utilize something like kindness to build that inclusivity, to get beyond the barriers of diversity, then I think we can't then look at distant, remote charity. Then I think the kindness has to be both personal and personalized. It has to be what's pertinent for you, not what is generally, you know, needed in, you know, XYZ province, region, or the like. And so, as I say, in terms of how we interpret kindness, I'd be interested in your views, and of course, those arising from the project you ran.
And thanks, that's a really interesting series of thoughts. And I've also been following the situation at Baragwanath with some interest, because on one level it's also shocking, and as always you see that somehow in South Africa we almost manage to make it work. Now we don't always get it right at all, but you know, you often think, sure, the nurses should have been running government and we would all have been fine, just in terms of who's actually responding to stuff on the ground. But one of the things that I guess that poses for me is, you know, when we think about corporate entities and businesses and at the various sort of non-public sectors of society, what gets rewarded? And I often think, you know, in KPI discussions, when we think about what we have to deliver and how that gets counted and accounted, and, you know, 25% of my time is this, 14% of my time is this, 3.8% on this, a lot of it is completely devoid of any relationality. And of course, it's relationality, it's friendship, it's love, and we never talk about love at work because that's seen as almost a huge taboo. And you know, how do you judge love and all of that? But just imagine that you did, and imagine that as part of your KPI, you had to demonstrate a certain element of positive citizenship, and you can call it kindness, you can call it Ubuntu. There's lots of different ways to get to that sentiment of working not as an individual trying to become employee of the month, but rather as somebody who's trying to spread benefits around very unequal communities. And when we think about that report that just came out, you know, if we acknowledge that we live in a society where goodness is remarkably concentrated in small places, how do we make sure that that spreads, not just financially, but also in terms of the emotional, the social impact? And something I often speak about in my teaching is just that capitalism is a global system that South Africa makes really real. Now, I'm certainly a capitalist. I'm in no ways anti-capitalist at all, but I think it's important to understand the system. And I remember a profound moment where I did my doctorate in the States, and I was in the south of California in San Diego, and I and my friends decided, okay, let's go to Mexico, across the border overnight for game, and we wanted to watch a soccer game in Tijuana, which is a neighboring city. And it was such a striking experience for me, because when we walked across the border, I was like, oh, this is like going into a South African township, because what you have is high density housing, lots of people, different kinds of noise, different kinds of management of space and relationality. And you also have a lot more poverty, and on the other side of the border, a lot more wealth. And there's something about the ways in which capitalism as a system functions that you've got to have people who are willing to work for very little in order for us to have the kind of corporate structures we have now. And my thing is not to say capitalism doesn't work, because clearly it's the best system we've got. That's what the Cold War was about. And we'll see what happens now with Russia, Ukraine. But when we think about the world systems that we want, and I think this is really critical to where we are now with the rise of China and Russia, and the kind of decline of the US empire. There's a lot of people saying inside South Africa as well, like, is democracy really a valuable thing anymore? And I'm not going to weigh in on that per se, but I think what's important to recognize is it's about our vision for society. And it's about rewarding what we think is valuable for society at every level, including the workplace, because the workplace is where we live most of our lives. And so when we talk about the personal impact of kindness, the collective impact of kindness, we need to think, well, how can we make this such a fundamental thing that, again, South Africa has a lot to offer the world, and saying, well, we recognize the mess in a way that if you're living in a wealthy country, you can ignore, and if you're living in a very poor country that doesn't have the same levels of inequality, you're almost so far outside of the capitalist system or the kind of system of empowerment in it that you don't have a voice at the table. But in South Africa, we really do. And I think we're uniquely positioned to say, okay, let's take the human desire for good and bring that into our workplace and lead the world in terms of taking collective responsibility, because that's what we saw in the lockdown. It's not like there weren't hungry people in South Africa before COVID. It's not like there aren't hungry people in South Africa now as COVID becomes less of a thing. But just for that short period, I do think that we saw a mobilization that we've never seen before in terms of food distribution, in terms of clothing distribution, in terms of saying, how do we get the stuff to the people who need it rather than keeping it concentrated in certain areas? And if only we could do that, I think we would put South Africa in a completely different space in terms of global leadership. And I really think that the corporate sector could lead that if they wanted.
But Jess, it's been a point that I've made regularly and in so many different ways. I'm not looking at the workplace sector as bearing a sole responsibility for anything. But I do come back to the view that actually there's a huge measure of self-interest, that if in your organization you can have productive employees who genuinely feel like you care about them, who feel like that they are valued and their contribution is valued. I mean, the benefits of that are absolutely self-evident. We don't need to focus on that. So I think that the workplace presents an extraordinary opportunity to make really a very significant difference. And what I'm hoping this topic will present to some of those who are listening to us is that as you use the examples where I mean, there were great manifestations of people being extraordinarily kind and caring, of really doing good during the pandemic, I think that can be not simply implemented, I think it can be quite easily almost institutionalized in an organization. And I think where we do that, I just said that the benefits are self-evident, but I mean to raise a core one, I would put it to you that where we're in an environment that's kind, we've already touched on the point that by definition means it's not judgmental, it's not hasty to judge. But can you see one of the invaluable outcomes would be that if we're part of an environment that's kind, what do you think the trust level is going to be? If I think you as my senior executive are kind and caring, what are the trust levels like? And again, once you've got kindness right, it can be like a wonderful catalyst. I think the outcome in terms of trust can be extraordinary. I wanted to go on to a discussion about value-based behavior, but before that, I'm conscious of time. And Sarah, I haven't been looking at the chat function, so I wanted to ask if there are any comments you'd like to share, or can I also say to our participants that if you pose questions on the chat function, Sarah will be sharing those with us. So Sarah, I'm not sure if there's anything that you'd like to share, or noteworthy comments? Jess, I know you picked up one earlier.
Yeah, so Jess, I think clicked in on Reginald's first comment around the ways in which they'd assisted employees during lockdown, and I think that people have made some great observations about what you've been discussing, but I think that the chat's actually also been quite nice in the sense that people have been commenting on other things. So I think that you can really look to continue. People are really just saying, that they find the conversation to be valuable and endorsing some of the messages that have been communicated.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Jess, and on that point, then I also wanted to run past you a concept that we've used a lot, that I've linked to kindness, and get your insight on that. And I'll try and share this in a kind way. I remember it was a little while ago, and I was part of a discussion. I will say it was around a public sector entity. It was talking about value-based leadership, and it did occur to me that they felt as far removed from value-based anything, a rule-based, that they were getting right without the consequence management. But we use this term of, value-based behavior, value-based leadership. And for me, of course, kindness falls solidly into that. But I wanted to share a concept that I think illustrates this so very well. And it's our concept of ethical maturity, which I know is used in so many ways. But how we use it is looking at ethical maturity from low to high. And by the way, distinguishing ethical maturity from unethical behavior. That's another conversation, I always say. But when we're looking at low ethical maturity, we recognize that as a situation where ethical conduct largely stems from rules, regulations, policies, procedures, possibly from supervision, and also from consequence management. And that you by the way, when you have rule-based behavior, you are getting someone to do the right thing. So they know the traffic light means they've got to stop on red, so they stop. This is a good thing. This is ethical. But I always say the catch with that low level of ethical maturity is it can amount to a situation where I say, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing, but I'm going to do the right thing because I know you'll check up on me, or I know there will be some consequences. And so the curved ball around maintaining ethical behavior, when you largely have a rule-based approach, the curved ball is that it rests so heavily on the consistency and the quality of enforcement. And therefore, it makes it what I call a very high maintenance system. You literally got to check up a lot. But then I always say, now let's move to higher ethical maturity. Here we're looking at conduct that doesn't derive largely from rules and regulations. Here we're looking at conduct that derives largely from values. So you would say to me, but Cynthia, respect is a core personal value. Of course I treat people with respect, but that's not only how I choose to behave. That's who I am. Now, I always say that with rule-based approaches and that lower ethical maturity, what you're achieving, let's be clear, is compliance. And again, compliance is a great thing. We could do with a lot more of it in our country. But when we're looking at higher ethical maturity, when you're saying I behave honestly, because that's one of my core personal values, the word there's not compliance. And I would suggest the word that captures that is commitment. And of course, commitment to values. And where those are shared values, and as I think that juxtaposition of the low and higher ethical maturity, I think it would be so easy to present this to an organization and say, okay, which ones have more value? And in all fairness, it's not an either or. Of course, you need rules and regulations, but where you have very strong commitment to values, I think it often, replaces the need for rules. You're going to stop at that red traffic light. because you're committed to the safety of your fellow drivers and yourself and your passengers. So the driver becomes quite different. And so the huge importance and the enormous benefit that comes from value-based behavior, I think, again, if we wanted to turn this into a more formal ethics discussion, kindness, and you can use the word care if you want to, fall solidly in that area. And I wondered how that concept would resonate with you.
Thanks. Lots to think about there. I was taking a bunch of notes. I'm looking forward to the transition to the business sector, but I don't know all the acronyms yet at all, and some of the language. But what really struck me was, as you were speaking, was thinking about how it's a lot easier for people to live good values when their tummies are full. And I mean that in a very sincere sort of, when you're struggling to meet your basic needs and you're struggling to meet the needs of your kids and your parents or whatever it is, obviously there's a lot more temptation to step into the gray, particularly if everybody around you is doing the same. And I think not of South Africa, but of Angola, where I lived for a long time. And those of you who know anything about Angola will know that the history's been rough there. Civil war until 2002, really limited economic opportunities. And people often from on the outside talk about the corruption of Angola and petty officials. And I had a little motorbike and used to ride around the city that I lived in, and I spent a couple of years there, so really got to know the space quite well. And I found that the issue of petty corruption a really interesting one, because the police were paid so little that on one hand, I really understood that if I were a policeman in Angola, whose only income stream was, firstly, my base salary, which was literally not enough for me to actually feed my family. But I was seeing people around me get rich all the time. And then there were a bunch of foreigners coming in who clearly had way too many dollars. I mean, just in the sense of, as a PhD student coming from Stanford into Angola, I had a completely different revenue stream to most of the professionals who were twice my age and who were trying to do better for their kids. And I think that the same really applies in all places of inequality, where if you're able to enter into the sort of mental space of people around you and say, and I'm really talking about management here, is before you say, oh, you know, this group of employees are lazy and corrupt and they steal, think very, very carefully about what you yourself would do in that situation. And it's, again, this kind of cliche from religious doctrine of, you know, what would God do in the situation? What would I do if I were wearing those shoes? But it's really important to think about. And I think that if management particularly is able to start, you know, I think the value-based behavior that you're talking about, firstly, it has to come from management. If you don't have that live with absolute integrity at the highest level of the organization, there's no way that anybody else is going to fall in line. But there also has to be something about really recognizing that people are trying to do well for themselves in whatever definition of well means. They're generally, like, nobody across the world wants their kids to have a harder time of life than they have. So if you give people then the tools to say, okay, what are your basic needs, Cynthia? Okay, you need this and this and this. Stefan needs this and this. Alzan needs this and this. Is there a way that we can structure into your KPIs, your day plan, your career, some possibility? So a janitor, you don't have many career mobility options, but what can we do to ensure that your kids are not janitors as well? Once you start doing that, I think it's a lot easier to then really talk about value-based behavior, because you're saying, firstly, I see you. And I think there's so much about South African history that shows how we don't see one another, or we're trained to see one another by our society in a way that all of these people are scary, all of these people are rich, all of these people trade in money and have these kinds of views. And we really have to get to a point where we start by saying, every single employee needs to be seen and recognized. I need to know where they live, how many people live in their house, what kind of food, you know, who are they supporting through university? Because it's easy for me with my corporate salary to say, okay, well, I can, you know, charitably pay some university fees. But if I have 15 cousins who also need university fees, my salary might not actually be enough. And maybe we need to think about that as well in terms of giving people variated salaries. I'm sure there are models to say, well, what are the dependencies that you have? Because a lot of the way that our corporate structures work is actually designed for a nuclear family that doesn't exist in South Africa. And those non-nuclear family models are spaces of tremendous kindness, of tremendous support, of tremendous sacrifice in terms of raising whole groups of people through the changing economic opportunities for South Africa. But I think that if we were to start from there, value-based behavior would have a real opportunity of succeeding. Whereas I agree with you that enforcement, yes, and compliance, sure. If I'm going to be checked up on, I'm going to make sure that I stay in these very narrow lines. But what happens if we really start changing how we think about people? And it might seem such an obvious point, but I think in South Africa we had to do so much so fast when we had the end of the apartheid moment. And again, in many ways, it's remarkable what we have managed to do. But then we also need to start rethinking our conceptualizations of the human. And often in the political sphere, you're just like, this feels so painful. Like the bluntness of the political language that we have is often quite difficult, but a lot of the time, if you listen carefully, what's being asked is, please see us as fully human. Please see us all as living in a space where we have a right to exist without diversity. And I think that we could do a lot more there, and that comes to what you're talking about, Cynthia, values. And once people, like, if you're hungry, you're going to do what it takes. And I mean hungry at the sort of simple level of the belly, but I also mean hungry in terms of limited opportunities for ambition. We see now, and we forget, this generation, for the first time in the last 20 years, we're all looking at the world through our cell phones. And so what we don't have is way, way, way closer. It's literally in our fingertips, where I can look and say, if only I could own a house in the suburbs. If only, what is it that stops me eating at a restaurant where all these other people are? And so that desire is so much closer. And so we have to acknowledge that and then work with it and channel that energy and say, okay, I will open up a pathway for you to get there. This is what's needed. Rather than saying structurally, sorry, forget it, you're never going to be part of the elite. Because then, of course, people will behave unethically. I would too.
I mean, I think two things that I take out of it, and one, looking forward, is I think that the comments you're making about inequality, I think could, and I'm putting it out there, and maybe our participants could comment if they'd be interested in, I think it could be a wonderful discussion for another conversation, because I think it can't easily be dealt with in the couple of minutes we've got left. But I think it is a core feature. But from my side, two concluding comments, and then I'll invite you to pass a concluding comment as well. I mean, a couple of concluding comments from me is we have heard so regularly, our government talking about the recognition that they've always applied it economically, that if we want to prosper economically, we need to create the conditions for economics to prosper. And so what I'd like to share with our audience and obviously with you is to say, how about looking at the question in our organizations of, are we creating an environment where we promote ethical behavior, the same as we would say, creating the conditions that would promote a sound economy? Are we creating an environment that would promote ethics? I think that's one parting thought I'd like to share. And then the other one I extract from what you were referring to in terms of leadership. And here, let me loudly agree that the leadership example is, of course, imperative. And in that regard, I think that it's important that leaders, when we're looking at kindness, when we're looking at care, need to recognize the very visible role model effect they have. And again, I think a simple guideline that leaders should always remember is that so-called golden rule, that not only we do unto others as we would have them do to us, but more directly, that we treat people and we care for them in the way we would want to be cared, and not fall into the trap of moving into that selfish space, especially in a society of such extraordinary inequality and need as ours. And so, as our guest, can I invite you to have the last word? I'm conscious we're a minute over, so in your hands to wrap up, Jess. Yeah, feel no pressure.
Thanks. I mean, it's been such a thought-provoking conversation. I guess maybe just to end and building on that, I'd say one of the things we have to consider are what are the questions that we need to ask our employees that lead to more acts of kindness, more acts of goodness, more inclusion. And I think it's often just that we're not asking the right questions in terms of behavior change. And perhaps that might be a parting thought, that we all go into our workplaces after this meeting. What do we not know that if we only asked, would change the behavior of people all around us, both up and down the chain. So thank you. I mean, I'd love any feedback. And as I said to Cynthia before, I'm making this transition to the corporate sector. So please let me know if there's things I can do differently that land better. But I really enjoyed interacting with you, Cynthia, and Stefan and Sarah, and then of course the audience. I hope it's been valuable, and I'd love any feedback if that's
Jess, many thanks. Stefan, can I hand back to you?
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. Wow, Jess, that was really, really insightful. Thank you for sharing your very personal experiences. Firstly, that led up to the writing of your book. It was almost like we relived the journey with you. Thank you for sharing your research and experience with us and putting these intricate concepts in a very practical context for us. On behalf of the EPA, I would like to thank Cynthia and Jess for unpacking the subject and discuss very practical examples that we can bring back into our respective worlds. Cynthia, as always, we're proud to have you with us in the EPA. And Jess, it's really an honor to have met you. And, you know, just to have a small peek in your world was really, really valuable. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I really hope we made you think a little bit about how we can use our pro-social behavior as human beings to make South Africa and the world around us a better place. Take care, be safe, and enjoy your weekend. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.